Some nights are just supposed to be easy. That's what I kept telling myself as I leaned back on the worn leather barstool. The sound of clinking glasses and the roar of a football match filling the air around me. Across from me, my best friend, Mike, sat nursing a beer and wearing the kind of smile that said life, for once, was simple. We were in our favorite sports bar, a dimly lit place where the walls were covered in memorabilia. The floors were sticky in a familiar way, and the TVs hung in every corner, each screaming with fans' cheers and players' shouts. Mike and I, we'd been through everything together. Childhood, high school, college, the whole 9 yards. Mike was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and charm it in an instant. He had this laugh, loud and boisterous, that could make strangers turn their heads and grin even if they didn't know why. Me? I was the quieter one, the thinker, the guy who planned everything. Opposites attract, as they say, and maybe that's why we'd always stuck together. That night, though, it felt good to be on the same wavelength. Just two friends, watching the game and letting the stress of the week melt away. I worked in finance, a soul-sucking job if there ever was one, and Mike had his hands full running a contracting business. Lately, life had been more about deadlines and responsibilities than it had been about living. But tonight, for a few short hours, none of that mattered. Remember that time we went to that high school game? Mike grinned, tipping his beer toward me. The one where you tried to ask Becky Harris out and tripped over the bleachers? I groaned, throwing a peanut at him. First of all, she said yes. Second of all, I didn't trip. I misjudged my step. Mike laughed, a full, hearty sound that filled the room. You fell on your face, man. Right in front of the cheer squad. Classic. Couldn't help but chuckle. You're one to talk. Didn't you once get your shoelace stuck in a vending machine trying to get a Snickers bar? Hey, I got the Snickers, didn't I? Mike smirked. Felt good to laugh like that, to let the weight of adulthood slip off our shoulders for a while. The game blared on in the background, our team struggling through the second half. We shouted at the screen like it made any difference, our voices blending with the rest of the bar. Around us, other patrons yelled, groaned, and cheered. A cacophony of camaraderie that made the world outside feel a little less lonely. Mike nudged me, pointing at the screen. You think they're gonna pull this off? Not a chance, I said, shaking my head. Their defense is like Swiss cheese, full of holes. We ordered another round of beers and some greasy appetizers we had no business eating. But who cared? These were the moments that made life feel real. We talked about everything: work, family, the old days. I told him about the time my boss made me redo an entire report at the last minute. He told me about a client who refused to pay for a kitchen renovation because they didn't like the shade of white he'd used. Ridiculous stories that, in the moment, seemed funny rather than frustrating. You know, Mike said, his tone softening, it's good to get out like this. I feel like we don't do this enough anymore. I nodded. Yeah, life's been busy. He looked at me for a moment, something unreadable in his eyes. How's Emma? He asked, referring to my wife. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. She's good, I said quickly. Busy with work. You know how it is. Mike gave me a look, the kind that said he didn't entirely buy it but wasn't gonna push. And you? You good? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. I'm good. The truth was, things with Emma had been strained lately. Nothing major, just little things that added up. Missed conversations, distracted moments, an occasional tension that neither of us could quite put into words. But tonight wasn't about that. Tonight was about escaping. By the time the game ended, a crushing loss for our team, naturally, the bar was thinning out. The crowd was quieter now, the buzz of conversation mellowing as people settled their tabs and stumbled toward the exit. Mike and I stayed a little longer, finishing our beers and laughing about old times. You ever think about how far we've come? Mike said suddenly, his voice thoughtful. I mean, look at us. We're adults now. We've got houses, jobs, wives. Back in the day, we couldn't even figure out how to change a tire. I laughed. Speak for yourself. I always knew how to change a tire. You were the one who called your dad every time. He smirked. Fair enough. We settled our bill, leaving a generous tip for the bartender who'd kept our drinks coming all night. Outside, the air was crisp and cool, a welcome change from the warm, beer-scented haze of the bar. The city was alive with lights and sounds, a reminder that while our night was winding down, the world was still spinning. Mike pulled out his phone to call a taxi. "You sure Emma's not gonna kill you for staying out late?" he teased. "Nah," I said, waving him off. "She knows I'm with you. Besides, she and Jessica are probably at home watching some reality show or gossiping about us." Mike grinned. "You're probably right." The taxi pulled up a few minutes later, the driver giving us a friendly nod as we climbed in. I glanced at Mike, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a long time. Whatever awaited us at home, I was grateful for this night, for the laughter and the memories. We sat back, the hum of the engine filling the silence as the city lights blurred outside the window. We got into the taxi. The taxi ride home was full of laughter, the kind that comes easily after a few drinks and the company of someone who's known you since you were a kid. Mike and I traded stories about our high school shenanigans, the way we used to sneak into movie theaters or blow our allowances on arcade games. The driver chuckled along with us at times, though he clearly had no idea what we were talking about. It didn't matter. For those 20 minutes, the world outside was a blur, and the warmth of nostalgia wrapped around us like a favorite old jacket. As the taxi pulled up in front of my house, I glanced at the warm glow of the porch light. Home. A place where comfort and love were supposed to live, where Emma would likely be waiting, maybe curled up on the couch with a book or chatting with Mike's wife, Jessica. I smiled to myself, feeling the lingering contentment of the evening. Mike clapped me on the back as we stepped out of the car. "You ever think about how lucky we are?" he asked, his voice light but sincere. "Good wives, decent jobs, and nights like this?" I nodded, fumbling for my keys. "Yeah, lucky." We walked up to the front door, still joking, still caught in the glow of the night. But as I slid the key into the lock, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a sound or a sight, just a feeling, an uneasy weight in the pit of my stomach. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, before shaking it off. The door swung open, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the familiar scent of home, Emma's lavender candle, or the faint aroma of whatever she'd cooked earlier, but something different, a mix of sweat and alcohol, sharp and invasive. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw them. My living room was a tableau of betrayal. On the couch, tangled in a way that made my stomach churn, were 4 figures. 2 men I didn't recognize, and, next to each of them, our wives. They were naked. For a second, my brain refused to process it. It was like staring at a photo where all the details are wrong, your mind scrambling to make sense of the impossible. My wife, Emma, was draped across one of the men, her laughter breaking the stillness of the room. Her hand rested on his chest, fingers tracing lazy circles, and her head was thrown back as if this was the funniest, most carefree moment of her life. Jessica, Mike's wife, was no better. She was nestled against the other man, her legs tangled with his, her hand dangerously low on his thigh. And the men, they sat there like they owned the place. Casual. Relaxed. One of them even held a half-empty glass of whiskey, his eyes flicking to us with a smirk that made my blood boil. The sound of their laughter was deafening, like nails on a chalkboard. It filled every corner of the room, mocking, taunting, as if daring us to react. For a moment, everything froze. My heart stopped. The air sucked out of the room. Felt like I'd been hit with a baseball bat, hard and fast. The kind of blow that leaves you reeling, unable to think, unable to breathe. And there, in the corner of the room, was the bat itself. An actual baseball bat, propped up against the wall. A cruel stroke of irony that made my chest tighten. I looked at Mike and he looked at me. We didn't say a word. We didn't have to. His face mirrored my own, shock, betrayal, rage. The kind of anger that bubbles up from somewhere deep and primal, an emotion so raw it's almost unfamiliar. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing down to that one moment. Emma's laughter, Jessica's smile, the strangers who dared to defile the sanctity of our homes. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, we moved. 2 steps forward, one for each of us. Our eyes locked on the corner of the room. The bats. Each of us grabbed one. Well, 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 I said, my voice low but trembling with rage as I held the bat at my side. My eyes locked onto Emma, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her cheeks, flushed from laughter just moments before, now drained of color. She pulled a throw blanket across herself in a feeble attempt at decency, though it did little to cover the sheer audacity of the scene before me. What are you doing here? She stammered, her voice shaking as her gaze darted between me and the bat in my hands. What am I doing here? I repeated, my tone cutting through the tension like a blade. That's a funny question, Emma. You mean in my house? The one we share? Or, should I ask you what you're doing here? And with them. The man beside her, a lanky guy with a pathetic attempt at a beard, sat up, his hands raised in mock surrender. Look, man, it's not what it looks like, he started, his voice cracking under pressure. Before he could get another word out, Mike made his move. Oh, what an interesting tour we've got going on here, he bellowed, his voice booming with mock amusement as he took a menacing step toward the other man on the couch, Jessica's companion. A shorter, stockier guy with tattoos creeping up his neck, jumped to his feet so fast he nearly tripped over the coffee table. Whoa, dude, let's talk this out. Yeah? The guy stammered, holding up his hands as if that would stop the freight train that was Mike. Mike was having none of it. With a roar that could have scared a lion, he swung his bat. Not at the man, but at the lamp beside him. The crash of porcelain hitting the floor sent shivers down my spine, and judging by the way Tattoo Neck nearly fell backward, it had the same effect on him. You're in my wife's house, Mike growled, his eyes blazing. On my couch. What's next? My car? My job? Mike, Jessica started, her voice thin and pleading. Please, let's just talk. Talk, Mike snapped, whirling on her. You think I want to talk? After walking into this? Are you serious? Meanwhile, Emma decided to try her hand at damage control. She reached for me, her hands trembling. Please, let's just calm down, she said, her voice cracking as she glanced at the bat still hanging at my side. It's not as bad as it looks. I let out a short, bitter laugh that even surprised me. Not as bad as it looks? I shouted, stepping closer. I slammed the bat down against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Emma, do you even hear yourself? I'm standing here, looking at you and him, and you're telling me it's not what it looks like? Then please enlighten me. What exactly does this look like? She started to cry then, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. But her tears didn't stir any pity in me. Not this time. It's not. He's just a friend, she blurted out, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lie. A friend, I barked, my anger spilling over. This is what you do with friends now? Sit naked on a couch, laughing like it's a sitcom marathon? The lanky guy beside her decided to try his luck again. Man, she said she wasn't happy, all right? But before he could finish, Mike cut him off, taking another step forward and raising the bat. You don't get to talk, he snarled, his voice low and full of menace. You don't ever get to talk to me. Do you understand? The man nodded frantically, his eyes darting toward the door. By now, the room had devolved into chaos. Emma was crying, Jessica was pleading, and both men were stumbling over their words, desperate to find a way out. But their excuses and apologies fell on deaf ears. We're done here, I said coldly, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Both of you out. Now. The lanky guy didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his clothes in a pile and clutching them to his chest as he bolted for the door. Tattoo Neck followed close behind, muttering a string of half-hearted apologies as he went. I stepped aside to let them pass, but not before raising the bat again, just enough to make sure they got the message. And don't even think about coming back, I warned. They didn't. They left so fast they forgot their shoes, which sat in a sad little pile by the door. As the door slammed shut behind them, the silence in the room was deafening. Emma's sobs filled the void, but I didn't look at her. Couldn't. Mike stood beside me, his chest heaving, the bat still gripped tightly in his hands. "Well," he said after a moment, his voice heavy with exhaustion and anger, "that's one way to end a night." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving Emma and Jessica in the wreckage of their choices. If you told me 6 months ago that my marriage would end in such a spectacular blaze of betrayal, I might have laughed in your face. But here I was, standing on the ashes of what used to be my life, feeling like a man who'd been through war. The divorce process was as messy as you'd imagine. Papers served, lawyers hired, arguments had in sterile offices with coffee-stained tables. The evidence from my home security cameras was the final nail in the coffin. The footage was undeniable. Strangers walking through my house as if they owned the place, laughing, half-dressed, and disrespecting everything I thought my home stood for. Emma didn't even fight it at first. She knew the evidence was airtight. When her lawyer tried to argue for a portion of the house or my savings, mine simply played the video. Silence fell across the room like a dropped curtain. After that, even her lawyer looked embarrassed to be there. The settlement was quick and brutal. No alimony, no assets from the marriage. She walked away with her personal belongings and little else. Mike's divorce followed a similar trajectory. The man may be loud and boisterous, but when it came to Jessica, he was ice-cold. He refused to engage in her tearful pleas, and his lawyer made sure she left with nothing but regret. But the real battle began after the ink dried on the divorce papers. Emma started trying to crawl her way back into my life. At first, it was subtle. A text here and there. Apologies dripping with guilt and desperation. "I made a mistake, I know that now. Please, can we talk?" Or my personal favorite, "I still love you. Doesn't that mean anything?" I ignored her. Every message, every call, every knock at my door. I didn't block her, though. I wanted her to know I saw her attempts and chose not to respond. Then came the grand gestures. One Saturday morning, I found her on my porch, holding a box of my favorite pastries from a bakery across town. She looked haggard, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes disheveled, but her expression was earnest, almost pitiful. "I thought we could talk over breakfast," she said, holding the box out like it was some kind of olive branch. I stared at her for a long moment, then calmly shut the door. The next time, it was a handwritten letter left in my mailbox. It was 10 pages long, full of apologies, justifications, and promises to change. She wrote about how lonely she'd been, how she'd felt unappreciated, how she'd let herself get swept up in something stupid. But I couldn't find it in me to care. Every word felt hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite the past. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. I came home from work to find her sitting on the front steps, shivering in the evening cold. She was crying, her makeup smeared, and clutching a photo album, the one from our wedding. "Please, just hear me out," she begged as I approached. I sighed, the weight of her presence pressing down on me like a heavy stone. "Emma, go home." "I don't have a home anymore," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I don't have anything. You took it all away." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't take anything. You threw it away." Her face crumpled, and for a brief moment, I felt the faintest pang of pity. But it was quickly snuffed out by the memory of that night. The laughter, the betrayal, the look on her face when I walked in and saw the truth. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But we were happy once. Don't you remember that? Don't you miss it? Don't you miss me?" I crouched down to her level, meeting her tearful gaze with a calmness I didn't feel. "You're right. We were happy once. But then you made your choice. You don't get to undo that just because it didn't work out the way you thought it would." She reached out to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "I'm sorry, Emma," I said, standing up. "But this? It's over. You need to move on." I stepped past her, unlocked the door, and went inside. She stayed on the porch for a while, but I didn't check to see how long. When I finally looked out the window, she was gone. Over the next few weeks, her attempts became less frequent. The texts slowed, the calls stopped, and eventually, the knocks on the door ceased altogether. In her place, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Mike and I stayed close through it all. We became each other's support system, trading stories of our rebuilding lives and laughing at the absurdity of it all. He threw himself into his work, and I started rediscovering hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside. I even started running again, something I hadn't done since college. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. And for the first time in years, I felt free. As for Emma, I don't know what happened to her after that. And honestly, I don't care. Months passed, and life slowly began to take shape again. At first, everything felt like a hollow echo of what once was. The house was quiet, too quiet. The routine I'd built with Emma was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. But in that stillness, I began to find something I didn't know I was missing: myself. Mike and I made a tradition of meeting up every Saturday morning. At first, it was just an excuse to get out of the house, to avoid the suffocating weight of solitude. But soon, it became something we both looked forward to. A weekly ritual of coffee, conversation, and a reminder that life goes on, even after betrayal. "Ever think about dating again?" Mike asked one morning as we sat on the patio of our favorite coffee shop. The sun was just beginning to warm the air, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee hung between us. I laughed, shaking my head. "Not even remotely." "You?" He smirked, stirring his espresso. "I'm not ruling it out. But for now, I'm enjoying the single life. No drama, no expectations. Just me and my work." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There was something liberating about being accountable to no one but yourself, about having the space to breathe and think without someone else's needs or secrets looming over you. But as much as I embraced my newfound independence, there were moments when the past would creep back in, small, insidious memories that caught me off guard. Like the time I found Emma's old cookbook shoved into the back of a kitchen cabinet, or when I heard a song on the radio that we used to dance to in the living room. At first, those memories stung, like tiny needles pricking my skin. But as time went on, the sting dulled. They became just memories, stripped of the power to hurt me. One day, while cleaning out the garage, I came across a box of our wedding photos. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether to open it or toss it straight into the trash. In the end, curiosity won out. Flipping through the photos was like stepping into a time capsule. There we were, younger and full of hope, smiling at a future we thought we could build together. I didn't feel anger or sadness as I looked at those images, just a quiet sense of closure. That chapter of my life was over, and it was time to let it go. I packed up the box and drove it to a donation center, leaving it there without a second thought. One evening, Mike called me with an idea. "Let's take a trip," he said. "Just the two of us. Somewhere we've never been before." "Like where?" I asked, leaning back on the couch. "Does it matter?" "Somewhere warm. Somewhere with good food and no responsibilities." I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Why not?" A week later, we were on a plane to Mexico, bags packed with nothing but shorts, t-shirts, and the promise of new memories. The trip was exactly what I needed. A chance to step outside of my routine, to see the world through fresh eyes. We spent our days exploring vibrant markets, eating street food that made our mouths water, and lounging on sun-soaked beaches. At night, we'd sit under the stars, sipping tequila and talking about everything and nothing. "I think I'm ready," I said one night, staring out at the waves crashing against the shore. "Ready for what?" Mike asked, tilting his head. "To move forward. Really move forward," I said, turning to face him. "I don't want my life to be defined by what happened. I want more." Mike grinned, raising his glass. "To more," he said, clinking his glass against mine. When we returned home, something had shifted. I didn't feel weighed down anymore. Instead, I felt lighter, like the weight of the past had finally lifted off my shoulders. I started taking on new challenges at work, saying yes to projects I would have avoided before. I joined a local running club, reconnecting with my love for the sport. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I started letting new people into my life. One of those people was Lauren. We met at a community fundraiser, where she was volunteering as an event coordinator. She had an easy laugh and a way of making everyone around her feel seen. We talked for hours that night, and when she smiled at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. Lauren wasn't like Emma. She didn't fill the silence with empty words or make promises she couldn't keep. She was honest and grounded, and being around her felt like a breath of fresh air. I didn't rush into anything, neither did she. We took our time, getting to know each other over coffee dates and long walks in the park. And for the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to the future, not dreading it. Emma tried reaching out one last time. A short, clipped text that read, "I heard you're seeing someone. I hope she makes you happy." I stared at the message for a moment before deleting it. She didn't deserve a response. My life wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about the betrayal or the pain she'd caused. It was about me, about the man I was becoming and the life I was building. And for the first time in a long time, that life felt good. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.